Dear friends of the Italian Cultural Institute, Abu Dhabi, excellencies, guest speakers, good afternoon, everybody. It is a great joy to introduce to our audience two remarkable figures in the art scene of the UAE and beyond. Allison is founding director of the art galleries and chief curator at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and she is responsible for numerous exhibitions in the UAE and abroad. Among her latest projects, I would like to mention at least, but we cannot see them, Tracing a UAE Art Community, 1988-2008, and this work, published in 2017, is a comprehensive survey of a UAE-based avant-garde community before it rose to international prominence and renown. Among other things, Allison has been nominated as curator of the UAE Pavilion in the 2022 edition of the Art Biennale in Venice. Many thanks, dear Maya, for accepting our invitation. Many thanks also to Isaac Sullivan, an artist and an academic, assistant professor of visual arts at Zayed University in Dubai, where his research interests include sound art, artificial intelligence, and the problematics of space and place. His videos, installations, and sonic interventions mainly focus on technically altered perceptions of time and are in turn linked to the Venice Biennale. They have been in fact exhibited at the Personal Structures, a 2019 Venice Biennale collateral hosted by the European Cultural Center, as well as in Tashkent Biennale and in Beirut Design Week. His performances, which often focus upon the phenomena of sound recording and playback, include outstanding galleries in Beirut, Dubai, and, difficult to say, Tbilisi. Thank you very much again to both of you. We all look forward to hearing your conversation on today's topic, the future of Emirati art at the Venice Biennale. Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to IIC for hosting this event. Also to Maya for being here today to tell us a little bit about her curatorial approach to the upcoming UAE Pavilion. And thanks to all of you who have come in person as well. So speaking of technically altered perceptions of time, we have a beautifully hybridized kind of event. So hello also to all of you joining on Facebook Live. We're going to begin with a short presentation from Maya. She's going to take us through some of Mohammed's previous works, and then we'll have a conversation followed by a Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you both, and thank you to the Institute for hosting this event. We'll start from the beginning. Good. Okay, so what you're looking at today is a sort of a general overview presentation of how I sort of conceptualize the work of Mohammed Ahmed Ibrahim, who is representing the UAE to the Venice Biennale in what will be the 2022 edition, what would have been right now if it hadn't been for the pandemic. And as we go, Isaac and I will sort of go back and forth on the ideas that come out of this in terms of how we think about this concept of the future of art from the UAE. And one of the first thing we have to do, of course, is look at the past. We look at the past in a way to understand what is now and what may come. And the past, it turns out, is a lot more complicated than some of the sort of generic international news coverage might suggest. Mohammed Ahmed Ibrahim has been practicing art in the UAE since the early 1980s. He's part of a very active but little known avant-garde that now is becoming very well known, but for most of those decades, it was a very sort of insider knowledge information to know about these artists. The thing he's most well known for is his land art series. What you're seeing here is a piece that he showed at Art Dubai, where he took a piece of Dubai, literally, and put it in 𝐁𝐤𝐿, and put a piece of 𝐁𝐤𝐿 in Dubai. And so here we have the removed piece of Dubai that is now in 𝐁𝐤𝐿. Now, he is born and raised in 𝐁𝐤𝐿. His family is from multiple generations there, and he's still there today. So there's often a kind of a cliche idea of the artist going to the big city to make it big as an artist. He never did that. He stayed in this small town on the seaside in the mountains of 𝐁𝐤𝐿 and continued to make very experimental practice. He's best, so this is the wrapped trees, and these are rocks from the mountains in his landscape wrapped in wire. This is a series he did recently of these sort of beehive structures that rumor has it were mistaken for archaeological finds later after he left them up. He loves that rumor. He's trying to promote it as much as possible. Not to promote it, but the idea that it could be mistaken for that. Another really well-known part of his practice is what I think of as his lines series. Notice that this is the name I'm calling it. It's just my own useful category. This derives from a story, partly a story from his childhood of tracking the delivery of water barrels on the wall of the house where he lives. And he found these lines so compelling that he started adding to them, which of course got him in a bit of trouble. And I like to say he's been making trouble ever since. The urge and the impulse to respond to the world around him and engage with it through mark making is one of the things that makes his art really come to life. Even though, you might think something abstract feels disconnected from the world around you. In fact, the connections appear all around in his work. This was the first international exhibition that he was in, but that was also of UAE artists in 1995. So the lines now start to become three-dimensional, crawling out onto the floor, becoming boxes. And then I commissioned him to do an updated version of that in 2017 as sort of an homage to that project, which by this time very few people knew about. Another aspect of his work is the hieroglyphics or pictograms. Neither of these terms really capture. He also calls them signs, symbols, male, female. He's been doing them since the 80s. He has this little booklet that he would draw every day. He said he had it in a drawer in his desk. He would pull it out when no one was looking and make his drawings. So he was sort of developing this form from early on. And this evolves into these sort of three-dimensional sculptures and more recent paintings. You can see the origins of these in the forms from the drawings early on. A lot of circle and line intersecting. And then again, this is my naming of it, the biomorphic series, because they feel like a recognizable animal or form, but then when you look closely, you can't quite place it. Thank you, sir. And then, in the exhibition that I curated at the gallery, on the left is a piece called Animal that he included, and on the right is a piece called Fence, which was the first piece I ever saw by him. When I first saw this piece, I was visiting the studio of 𝐏𝐚𝐯 𝐿 the year that he was going to represent the UAE to the Venice Biennale, or the year before, I guess. And I saw this piece, and my hair stood on end. Like, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. And it never comes across in a photograph, but when you're in the room with a work like this, it radiates this energy that I can't put my finger on, but it's really remarkable. When it works really powerfully. And I was like, who is this? And he's like, oh, he's this artist. He lives over in 𝐁𝐤𝐿, I'd never seen anything quite like it before. And I thought it was like a hipster kid. It looked like this super cutting edge art. And to learn that he was one of our most senior artists was a really wonderful surprise. And I realized there was a lot to the UAE that I had not realized, and that if I hadn't realized it, chances are many people had not. So I'm going to pause there because that gives you like an overview of his art. And this is where I'm sort of tracking I start following his work, and then I put him in various exhibitions, which leads to him inviting me to be his curator for the Venice Biennial. So over to you.
So as you've said, Maya, there's been a shift within the past couple of years in terms of the Pavilion's approach to facilitating. Previously, curators were selected and in turn identified which artists would be featured. Recently, it's shifted to where an artist is selected, and then the artist gets to choose which curator they'll be working with. So it's interesting to hear about how you've gotten to know the artist over time and how your impressions of his work have shifted. And we're going to see more of that trajectory in the upcoming slides. But first, I'd like to pause to ask, what do you think that it means, firstly, this shift? So what does it mean for an artist to be selected and then to choose the curator as opposed to vice versa? What does that reflect? And also, how has that shaped your approach to the practice of curating in this case?
That's a great question, and more complicated than you might think. But I'll try to keep it short. So this is the first year recently in which this has been the case, what he wants to be doing, right? And so, and that we have a mature enough art scene now that that this is the time when we can sort of shift how we approach curating and selecting a curator for a biennial. I believe that in earlier editions there has been some process of this, but this is the first time in quite a while. So because I had been working with Mohammed for a long time, I think his selection of me, we felt a very mutual kinship and relationship already. And he called me and he said, you know, his affectionate hello, and I have some news for you. And we both were like, we both just rejoiced. You know, we had this mutual just rejoicing time of this moment is, you know, I believed for a long time that he's really an important artist. I'm so glad to see this recognition. And then we had to figure out, how are we going to do this and to negotiate. He says, you know, he really wants my feedback. He really wants my input. And I really want him to, you know, find the core of his most powerful vision. And so in many ways, I view our relationship as very much to a book editor to a writer. So the writer originates the idea, develops the concept, writes the prose, and the editor, a good editor, goes in to see what is great about the work and helps draw it out and gives the feedback to help draw it out and the revision suggestions. And there can be a productive tension and exchange between the writer and the editor, or the curator and the artist, to help refine and sharpen the vision. The vision is there, there's no question. And then, what I've found with Mohammed in particular is that a lot of people hadn't seen his body of work completely. They knew one or two pieces, but mostly they knew the two that are on the screen right now. And they knew something about the land art. And so when I visited his studio and I saw what was actually happening that hadn't been shown, this was back in 2016, I realized that there was something happening here that people needed to see, or that I felt was important to see. And he responded to that feedback in a way that created trust between us. So he felt seen, I felt my vision was sort of verified. So we would constantly check with each other. I see this, do you see this? I'm doing this, do you see it? And then back and forth like this. And I don't speak Arabic, and it is his first language. And so there's these moments where the communication is happening with eye contact. Look at the art, look at each other, look at this, look at each other. And it's a really, it's a very interesting kind of relationship that is not a classic curatorial one where I say, this is good, this is not good, we're gonna do this, right? It's more like, this one is breathing, this one isn't yet, you know? And then he's like, yeah, I know, this is a problem. I don't know what to do, I'm gonna throw it away. I'm like, don't throw it away, let's sit with it, you know? And so this process is really, really good. I don't wanna reveal too much because it's our own process, but I hope this answers your question. It's a very collaborative process, but he's clearly the originator and I'm sort of being a mirror in many ways, yeah.
Thank you for unpacking that. As any artists or curators who are viewing this can tell you, there are a lot of different approaches to curatorship. So it's interesting to hear about how you have been approaching it with the artist across time. I'd like to ask a more specific question about your approach to the UAE Pavilion as a site. Before we do, I think it might be interesting to view a couple more specifically of his works that you have to share, and then we'll pause and speak about the pavilion.
Great. So this was the first work that I selected to put in an exhibition for our inaugural exhibition at the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery in 2014. I had never met him. I had just seen the fence piece I showed you earlier, and this. The photographs don't show how the copper of the rocks gleam, but so I loved the piece, and the piece spoke to me in a very direct and visceral way. And then I met the artist. That was, you know, we had a sort of a friendly rapport. It felt like a one-off, you know, and it wasn't until the studio visit later that things really developed. But this is just some views of that. And I watching him through different exhibitions. These are images from the first studio visit. And then I did a really in-depth interview with him for the But We Cannot See Them project. And this is when I also saw how his work changed when he went to Kochi. So he was on a residency in Kochi when we conducted this interview. And in that residency, he was making work as he always does, pulling from the materials around him. And the work, as you can see, is quite different from what the earlier work that I showed you. It's got this beige tonality to it. It's cardboard. He uses paint, but he uses it sparingly. But you can still see the lines and the sort of tension between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional, and then these little packages that he often suspends from his objects to create movement. And this was when he and I sort of realized that I understood his work in a way that was effective at this point, very active, incredibly prolific, more than ever at this time. And so he took me to, and then he stayed on in Kochi and took me to his studio, which became known as the Candy Box, because it's very brightly colored on the inside. And I'm not going to show a picture of it because it was a private space for him. But in the Candy Box, there was a huge shift. The Candy Box is painted in like pinks and purples and yellows, and red, and his artwork started to look like that. Then I put him in the But We Cannot See Them exhibition. And then again in Abu Dhabi Art in the curated section called Gateway, I connected his work to multiple artists who work with the line. And then again, I saw this work at Quadro Gallery. He made it in Holland in 2015. And if you look at this color palette, it's not what he had at the Candy Box. It's not Kochi, and it's not like any of his previous work. Again, he's responding to the paper and materials and tonality of the world that he's in. He said that when he made these, he just sat in his hotel room and made art continuously for the whole time he was there. And then he had a major solo show at the Sharjah Art Foundation. And here you see, you remember those little drawings in his notebook from the 80s when he's hiding them in his desk drawer at work. Now they're covering the walls of the Sharjah Art Foundation. Just really a fantastic installation. And a recent show of his at Laurier Shabini in Al-Serkal, which represents him. Here, he's moved into a very colorful phase now. He was doing almost no black and white anymore. And again, this sort of biomorphic forms. The pieces in the back, they're both boulevards and like cells or plants. And he wants them, he sort of lets them be both at the same time. These are some details. The Lady Contessa is this fantastic piece, but still he's using coffee and tea, charcoal, mixing them in his paper mache in order to get the color tonality that you see, versus in the Lady Going to a Party in a Hurry, where he's using brightly colored papers as his source material. And that's the end of my presentation. That's what he looks like there on the right when he's at his happiest. Okay. Thank you.
If we can in fact go back into the slides for a moment, because I have a question that relates to his use of the line and the way that these lines interact with architectural forms. And I suppose we can leave it there because we can see some of the evolution of the line works as they were produced during the residency in Kochi. And I'm interested in the way that the line series was inspired by a tally of deliveries inscribed on an architectural form, and then kind of came around full circle to being almost building blocks of what appear, as you can see in the slide, to be themselves architectural forms. It's almost as though he's telling a story of what he initially had seen or what he had done before, using these arte povera elements of working with what's on hand in different places. So, in light of his work with architectural forms, I want to pivot to a question about both your curatorial approach to the UAE Pavilion and his creative approach to it. When we talk about a national pavilion, of course, we mean it in the metonymic sense. We mean both the physical structure of the pavilion and also the activity of producing the works that are housed there. And in many cases, we can even see in other national pavilions, artists responding directly to the architecture. For example, Mark Bradford in the US Pavilion, who also has arte povera elements in his work. And so my question is, to what extent are you approaching the pavilion specifically as a site that is going to generate works as opposed to a space that contains works? Is the artist going to be presenting works that he has previously made there? Is he going to be producing works on site? And how are you thinking about this in your curatorial approach?
Well, I have to start by saying that we will formally unveil the plan for the pavilion in the future. So all I can do now is speak innuendo.
I'm going to keep prying and you can keep tantalizing us with snippets, whatever you can share.
But Mohammed is very prolific, so he's producing constantly. And our hope is to show that new production and give a sense of what the future of his work will look like. So that this is, although he has a very deep history, this exhibition is looking, it looks at that in some ways, but sort of a new approach to it. So I will say he's working like crazy right now, making new work. What ends up going in, I can't say. So.
Okay, well, you have
Things,
our attention.
things you have never seen from him before. How about that?
Things beyond our imagining.
But we do, to the part about the pavilion physically, you know, it would be nice if we could go and be in residence and be responding to the world of Venice in his work, which I would love to see him do, and he probably will while he's there. Right now, when we talk, we're imagining space. So we look at pictures of the space, the texture of the old Arsenale walls, these sort of, these aged brick walls, the texture of the floors, the high ceilings with black metal beams, all of these are figuring into how we conceive of the installation. But it's, again, it's like an imagined space as opposed to when he is in a place and he's responding with his whole being to the physicality of the space. So much of his work happens in the course of discovering it physically. And so you can't really do that in the abstract. So in many ways, what he's doing is still responding to 𝐁𝐴 and the UAE, and the tension of this enormous mountain that casts a shadow every day in the afternoon over the whole city. And so they only ever see sunrises, they never see sunsets. And there's an ocean that has been the source of plunderers. It's also been, you know, his father worked on the ocean. He lived in Kuwait for a time. So the ocean is very important also. But I asked him about this, and he says, you know, we really look towards the mountains because the mountain has such a huge impact. So they're right there on that thin strip of land between the mountain and the ocean. And that tension between the moving and the stable, the burrows and the ways that homes were made in those mountains historically and even up until today are very much part of his, how he thinks about forms. When you ask him about architecture, he loves to talk about it actually, and he'll say, you know, in architecture you have square shapes and you have round shapes, and sometimes you have square and round shapes, and that these, but he doesn't say it like that. He says it in a much more like there's a resonance to each shape. Each shape has its own resonance, and that together they create yet another resonance. And if you think about trying to fit together the rocks that he does when he's building a land art piece, for example, or picking out which rocks become part of the rock circles that he makes. He's very much in dialogue with his physical world in a way that could be called, it's similar to architecture, and it has a very architectural sensibility. So I'm glad you brought that up.
It's fascinating to think of him in the shadow of the mountain, or I guess seeing nothing but sunrises, and also at the same time visualizing in his mind's eye the space of the pavilion. I'm going to probably paraphrase a quotation from him, but if memory serves, he has said that his work takes shape between the eyelid and the eye, in some sense as the eye is closing, if I'm getting this right. And I definitely see this phenomenological dimension to his practice of working with materials and image making as well. And so I'm going to pivot here to a question about the future of the UAE Pavilion, and its relation to the contemporary as well as to historical narratives. I think one thing we can say about the contemporary is, well, as 𝐏𝐦𝐢𝐫𝐞 said, it represents a kind of asynchronous synchrony. There's a feeling of either arriving a little bit late or a little bit early, right? And similarly, I think we can talk about how, yes, pictorial space always sort of erupts into the present by showing what is not present, but the temporality of that process has shifted significantly. So it's interesting to think of him both responding to the landscape when he's at home and also holding in his mind's eye the pavilion. My question for you about the future of the pavilion is that on the one hand, we've seen curatorial approaches that are very much about individual artists and historical narratives. You've contributed quite a lot to the writing of histories around UAE art. And on the other hand, in some cases, we've also seen approaches that deal collectively with contemporaneity, groups of artists living and working within the UAE. I guess you could say perhaps the artist is a hybrid figure in that sense, since he's both a historical figure and active within a contemporary context. How do you see this distinction within the future of the UAE Pavilion moving forward?
It's interesting because it's tempting to cast him as a historical figure, and he is the founding figure in many ways, but he's part of this community of multiple generations of contemporary artists who are working now. So he's a very active sort of participant in that, and not only as like a senior advising mentor, but actually as a peer, sort of a senior peer mentor in many ways to other artists. And so one of the pavilions, 2 pavilions back, curated by Mohammed Nasser, did I say his name wrong? Oh my gosh, I hope I got it right. Anyway, a few pavilions back looked at sort of emerging UAE artists and put them together with Mohammed Nasser, that's what it was, put them together with senior UAE artists, and you could feel a real dialogue between these historical works and these contemporary works. And they were showing historical works by these more senior artists in this exhibition, which would have been, I think, 2017. And that was a nice moment because you feel this sort of progression, this idea of the future of art in the UAE. With Mohammed's work, we can do that, but we can also see that the thinking that he's doing now is actively engaged with sort of the future of form coming out of the UAE, and that this is something that I see younger artists responding to, but also he himself still has a future as an artist, and this is one step in that progression. And I think much of this exhibition process has been sort of thinking about where else can we go with this, and what else can we do, and what haven't we done yet. And so when we think about future pavilions, I would imagine that we'll continue to see this tension between discovering a past that has existed very vibrantly and acknowledging and recognizing this incredible rising generation of artists that have come up recently. I think with the sort of increasingly robust arts ecosystem that we're starting to see develop here, there is a huge growth in kind of arts activity among younger generations. And I was really curious, since you're an arts professor, if you have seen an increase in interest among students in the arts. And what that, I mean, you as much as anyone can see the future. We both work in education, but you're directly teaching students. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's definitely been a lot of energy and a lot of activity that I've observed since joining the College of Arts and Creative Enterprises at Zayed University in 2018. And in fact, over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen our enrollment in the college triple. So this gives you some sense of the energy and enthusiasm for contemporary art practices here in the UAE. It's an exciting time to be here and work with the students who, I should say, take very diverse approaches to art making, as you might expect, but all of them, I would say, are becoming familiar with the artists who have worked in, and lived in the UAE in past decades, as well as sort of the figures from the global art historical canon and contemporary artists from here and all over the world. And they're being invited to really reckon with the question of you know, whether modernism, the extent to which modernism is relevant within the here and now, within the contemporary. And so that's been really interesting to see. I want to ask you one more question.
No, I have another question for you.
Okay.
Why do you think that there's so much more enrollment? Do you think it's just sort of cooler now to be an artist here?
I think so. I mean, I think, you know, my students are very connected with social media.
Mm-hmm.
They're very familiar with contemporary art discourses that are happening both regionally and globally. And I think that it's an opportunity for them to ask questions and start conversations that might be difficult to enter into in other contexts.
Yeah. Yeah.
This can be generative of new connections and questions concerning gender, historical narratives, space and place, just to name a few.
Great, great. That's exciting. Okay, your other question. I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to ask you a question about land art historically, globally, and then in a contemporary context. But I think, in fact, probably this would be a good time to open things up to the group that's assembled here.
Sorry, I thought that was off. I just took a picture of my ringer. Okay.
You have a screenshot as a souvenir. You're too popular.
Airplane mode. Sorry.
Okay. So yeah, I think I'd like to invite the participation of those who have intrepidly joined us today.
It's so nice to look out and see an actual audience, not on screen. Thank you so much for being here in person.